So what is the story on biologicals? Why do we need them? How has there been such a proliferation of biologicals? Crop inputs are now just dripping out here in production agriculture, and they're coming from every direction. Also, lots of money poured into the space. I'm going to ask all those questions that you have about biologicals with my friends from BWFusion.
Hey, Damian Mason here with a question before we hop into this episode of the Business of Agriculture. If you farm for a living, you employ a lot of amazing technology, from your inputs that you put into the soil to the tractor that you sit in, your combine, the amazing data that it harvests. But has your soil analytics kept up technologically with everything else in your farming operation? I would venture to say that no, it is not. Sure, you check for your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, your micronutrients as well. But what about disease pressure? Do you know what diseases and what pests you're going to face next year? No, you don't. But you can now figure that out with Pattern Ag's predictive analytics. Think about it. They can tell you now with testing what the likelihood of facing nasty diseases, things like cyst nematode or sudden death syndrome, what the likelihood of you having this in your field, then you know how to prepare, how to treat, and where to invest your money. It's using technology to make you bigger yields and therefore make you bigger money. Go to www.pattern.ag to learn more. They are pioneering the way in predictive agronomy.
Hey there, and thanks for joining us for another great episode of the Business of Agriculture podcast. It's me, your host, Damian Mason. You knew that when you tuned in. I've got Greg McClure. He's an Illinois farmer, and I've got Sean Nettleton. He is a technical agronomist for a company called BWFusion. BWFusion's got me booked to do a speech for them at a meeting they're having in Peoria in August. And I said, you know what? I'd like you to come on my air. I want to be very honest. There's a lot of skepticism out here about these biologicals. My side job, working for Extreme Ag, we talk about biologicals all the time in the fields, and we're out there, and we get the pat answer. Well, you know what? It adds 5 bushels. Like, great. How? When do we use these things? Why do I need them? I've got really good farm ground here in this Midwest. Why do I need these things? When do I put them on? What is the actual activity that we purport to see and do and create? So I'm going to ask those questions. First off, Sean, thanks for being here. Technical agronomist for the company. And you said you cover from Wisconsin to the Delta region down in the South, yes?
That's right.
Yes, you cover some ground. And then, Greg, I got to confess here, dear listener, Greg and I actually have experience together. We sat and had drinks that I think we charged someone else for in Deadwood, South Dakota. It was one of those really interesting experiences. I did 4 presentations in 24 hours time between Sioux Falls and Deadwood. It was a screamer of a barnstorming kind of a 24-hour period. And I said, I'm ready for a couple of beers. Lo and behold, my buddy Jason Schley takes me and Greg and a couple other people out, had a few beers, talked about stuff, and here I am with him again today. Why do we need biologicals, Greg? Why do we need these things? You've got great dirt. You're on the Illinois-Indiana border. You're like in as good a dirt, as good of a sandbox as God created. Why do you need these products?
Well, I'm not actually in that area. I have the poor dirt in Southern Illinois.
By the way, your poor dirt in Southern Illinois, if you sprinkled it like in Wyoming, they'd say this is the most amazing stuff we've ever seen. So it's all relative, right?
It's all perspective, right? Yeah. Yes. You know, and I like to look at it like this. I mean, there's so many things as a farmer, right, that I just was not aware of. You go back not too many years ago, and I just kept going through this process of we have manure, you know, and I knew when I applied manure, all of a sudden that ground changed. And why did it change? Well, I started thinking about that, and I thought, well, if it's just the N, P, and K, then why doesn't that happen with my commercial fertilizer, right? So I learned that there had to be a lot more to it, right? And that's what you start to learn is that's the biological side of it. That's the enzymes, that's the amino acids, that's the other things that aren't in traditional NPK.
All right, so Greg, I get it, and I think that you're going down the road that I am glad you are going down the road agronomically. We know it's not just the macronutrients. And so, yes, what does manure do? Well, it improves tilth. And you ask the person, you tell somebody that, like, I don't know what that means. You're talking about organic matter improvements. And through organic matter enhancements, then we get more porosity. We get more ability to avoid compaction. Those are the kind of things you're talking about. But you're not telling me that's manure. BWFusion doesn't sell manure, do they?
We do not. But But what we try to do is create all the benefits that you can get from manure. That's the objective. All I wanted to do was to figure out how to make my non-manure ground, because obviously I don't have it on every acre, but we saw the improvement on the manure ground. So how do we make non-manure ground perform more like manure ground? What's the magic that's in the manure? What are those things that improve that soil and improve productivity of the plant because of that?
Hey, Sean, you're the technical agronomist here. Let's face it, Greg's just an Illinois farmer. And you know what they always say, the deeper the topsoil, the dumber the farmer. He's got not the best Illinois ground, so it still is like better than anywhere else in the world. He doesn't know what he's talking about, does he? You're not putting manure in a jug. Anyway, I'm joking with him because he and I have a relationship. What's the story? And by the way, you also notice he's one of those guys that calls it manure, like it's spelled Newer, like it's newer than older. I call it manure. Right. I call it manure. Who's right?
Well, when you have a last name of McClure, you don't pronounce it like manure.
Anyway, what's the deal here? The stuff that you have, and before we get into that, it's not all these biologicals. These other biologicals don't profess to say we're trying to mimic manure. What is the story? What is the stuff that you, when you go and talk to somebody and you said, here's what's in our jug? What do you tell them? Do you tell them it's like manure? Does it give you the enhancement of manure? What do you tell them?
Well, I think I don't necessarily talk about it from a manure perspective, but we always use the manure as kind of that anecdote or that the thing that we talk about, because that's the thing everybody understands, right? We understand that guys that have manure tend to have less nutrient demand, and their crops are better, and they can use less nitrogen, and they can do those different things. And so we think about it from that perspective, but I don't necessarily think I call it manure in a jug. But I think we understand that when you look at somebody that has manure, that uses manure, and you look at somebody that uses, whether it's all dry fertilizer, liquid fertilizer, whatever, we know that those things aren't equal, right? And guys have done that, right? You got manure, and you run out on half the field when you say you're pumping hog manure in this part of the world, and you run on half the field and you say, well, I'm going to go and spread dry fertilizer on the other half of the field. That crop will not look the same. It oftentimes doesn't perform the same as dry fertilizer only. So we know that it's more, like Greg alluded to, more than just NP and K. So what are the things that we're adding in there? We know that it's the biology and those different pieces. And so what we've got is a consortium of biology that are basically, each strain has a job to do. And we found that they, each have something specific that they do that we can put together and get some of that effect to release some of those nutrients that are in the soil, or even the nutrients that we apply, dry fertilizer, make more of that available to the crop.
So all biologicals are not created equally, right? And there's been this huge proliferation of biologicals. I mean, in the last 10 years, a raft, a barge full of money came into this space. Sure. Is that the story on BWFusion? Are you in a new company in the last 10 years? And give me the kind of the story on biologicals from the farmer perspective, Greg, and I want to hear it from the agronomics. You've been farming for a couple of days. When's the first time you started using biologicals, Greg?
About 3 years ago would have been my first introduction to the world of biologicals.
And that's when the proliferation began. But we had biologicals before that. Why did what switched? What tripped your switch?
Well, for me, honestly, it was just a search for knowledge, right? To try to figure out how to unlock what was in my soils. I mean, I started down the path of calcium and not knowing why calcium wasn't available in my soil, even though my pH was correct, even though my base saturations were high, but yet I didn't have calcium available to the plant, or why in some areas where my phosphorus levels were higher than others, but yet I had more phosphorus available in my plant where I had less in the soil, according to a soil test than. And so those are the kind of questions you set out to answer. And you realize, I figured out, I guess it didn't take long where, just like with manure, as an example, I mean, you make a change and you improve yields with it and you improve your soil with it, but just going out and adding more and more and more, this idea of making a more a more on application, putting more on all the time, right? It didn't take me long to figure out that wasn't the answer, that a more on application is not always a good thing.
Did you send this guy out to talk to farmers and tell them they're making more on applications? That's some good stuff right there. But it's true, Sean. My buddies over at Extreme Ag, like Kelly Garrett's very, very big on saying that. He's like, we thought that the entire thing, all you had to do is go out there and dump more fertilizer. It's fairly inexpensive. It was until a few years ago. Co-op loves to sell it. Dump more fertilizer. Go out there and just fling the stuff everywhere. And the reality is, in many cases, as Greg's alluding to, we're learning it's not a lack of fertility. It's a lack of uptake, or it's a lack of availability, or some other thing within that. So kind of speak to that agronomically, please.
Well, I think that's a great point. I think of it as fertilizer. I think of it as water. You always hear someone say, "Oh, if I got one more rain, my beans would have made 10 more bushel." Well, where I live, I got to pivot 100 yards from my house. I got to pivot, a quarter mile from my house this way. I live in an irrigated area. When we're dry, we turn water on, right? And just because you have water doesn't mean you get more bushels. I think fertility is the exact same way. Just because you put more out there, a lot of times I've even seen the opposite. The more you put out there, the less response you get, to a point of if you do a trial and say, I'm going to pour on potash or something like that,
right,
you very likely can see the yield go backwards. And what that tells me, and this is kind of what led me down the path of ending up here and working with Jason and working with Bodie and these guys, was looking for some sort of balance in the soil, look for a balance in the plant. And I think the plant is the thing that I pay the most attention to. Is, if we pile on more phosphorus, if we pile on more potassium, we tend to knock something else out of whack. And when we knock that other thing out of whack, it's a limiting environment, because,
Yeah, that runs counter to what you guys are both talking about. It runs counter to what we've been told. And, and again, even the land grant universities, let's face it, whether it's because it's what they do, or it's because there's a prejudice, or whether it's because they're getting paid by agricultural companies, they never talked a lot about biology. I mean, I took some agronomy classes. They never talked about soil biology. This is, I think, the new frontier. I tell my audiences, I say, you know what? We went through the iterations of, horses to, like the logo over here on McClure Farms, from horses to horsepower. We did all those things. And then the chemistry thing, starting really post-World War II, 2,4-D, obviously a herbicide that literally changed the corn production and yield potential, because we killed off broadleaves, et cetera. The biology thing is new. It's new territory. And I think that my perception is we know less about soil biology. We might know more about like the surface of Mars right now than we know what's happening in our soils. Is there any agreement on that?
I agree 100%. I think it's kind of the new frontier. And, I think that, for me, this is my opinion. I went through university as well, got a master's degree. I think that there's probably more innovation happening in the private sector now than the university sector. And I don't know that it's necessarily tied to money. Honestly, I think it's scope. I think that private companies have the ability to put products on more acres. Every farm, the way we collect data, every farm now kind of becomes a data set to some extent. And I think we get taken out of a little plot work, and we can use the Midwest, the South, the North, every area we sell in, we get to use that as our trials. And I think that we have a bigger scope and a bigger ability to learn faster, to be honest.
So, Greg, you've been around the farming game for a couple of days. You started using biologicals 3 years ago. So the answer was, you kind of came to it and said, it's not a fertility issue. I'm going to go to the next thing. And so you are not unlike, like my buddies, them, Extreme Ag guys, they said the same thing. Okay, we now know that we got enough phosphorus out there. Hell, we might have too much phosphorus. We know we got this. What's the next tool in the toolbox? So biologicals are a tool in that toolbox. But I still think the skepticism exists, because I can go down my driveway. My wife actually sprays the driveway, and I can spray glyphosate, and I know in 3 days everything's going to be browning up and dying. It's hard to as easily quantify the biological thing. Is that where the skepticism arises?
Well, I think it does to some degree, and I think I think that, every area, the native biology is different within each different soil type. So what does that consortium, do you have a broad enough spectrum consortium of biology to influence other, not just to influence one thing, right? Because that soil type, what may already be available in that soil, you may already have an abundance of that particular strain, okay, of a microbe as an example, or of a bacteria. So I think, that's one of the things that comes into play. What is it that you're short of? I mean, maybe at the end of the day, yeah, you don't see something in yield because what you were after wasn't what was your limiting factor. Maybe you needed a broader spectrum consortium of biologicals as an example. I think so. When you try something on one field, that doesn't mean it's you may need something different on a different field. We all buy crop insurance and we buy it every year to protect, right? And but most of the years, it has a negative ROI on it over time. I mean, it's going to have for you. And I'm not suggesting that's what this does here, but what I'm saying is sometimes when we try something, we tend to throw it out if it didn't work first time for us. I see that all the time. I mean, I think most of us, and I was guilty of it 10 years ago too. I mean, it's just the fear of change. It's the fear of trying something completely out there. Now what I like to do is I like to push the limit till something breaks, something fails. And I think that's where a lot of us are at. It's a mindset that you have to open your mind up to these different things. And all of a sudden, I mean, some of the struggles that I've dealt with for years trying to do this or that within the plant or raise something in tissue or actually make a physiological change to the plant because I'm releasing a different nutrient at a different time because of the biological that I added. All of a sudden now I'm seeing these things and it's opening up my eyes to this, And so you get an aha moment, and that moment is exhilarating at the time. The only problem with it is then about 5 minutes later, you realize it opened up 10 new questions you'd never thought of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, Sean talked about getting the balance. If you went out and just decided to horse up the phosphorus level, you might be messing up the balance on 13 other things by doing so. I want to get into how it works because there is, again, I want to talk about the actual functioning, how it works, how your stuff works, and how other biologicals work. Before I do that, I want to remind you, if you are a farmer, you probably spend about 19% of your time searching for answers to find solutions to problems you have. That stat comes from my buddy, Rob Syke. Rob Syke is an agricultural entrepreneur. He's like a very innovative guy, especially for a Canadian. Anyway, he founded a company called AgVisor Pro. AgVisor Pro. If you're watching this, I'm pointing at my hat. Essentially, he said, you know what? You get these guys that need answers. What are they going to do? Go on Twitter so they can then get, maligned and harassed by the dumbasses online? Because you know that. Instead, he invented AgVisor Pro. It's very simple. You go on your phone. And you can then, it's an app, okay? It's just an app on your phone. You use your phone every day, right? It's called AgVisor Pro. It's a free app. You can go and find someone. If you say, I need to know how to utilize this biological, for instance, you can find a biological expert on AgVisor Pro. You don't need to take my word for it. Just listen to this.
We were sitting on the fence about booking the rest of our fertilizer, but after one quick session with Mo Augustino, that really just kind of gave us the kick that we needed and to finalize the rest of our booking. In a week or so, the price rallied $100-$200 a ton and subsequently saved us over $70,000.
All right, that's from AgVisor Pro. Okay, how does this work? Sean, you already did the subtle brag. Did you hear that, by the way, the subtle brag, Greg? When he said, well, of course, I've been to Land-Grant University and I have a master's degree. He did that sort of make sure that he was telling us that we're not quite as well educated as him. Anyway, subtle bragger, Sean, how do these things work?
That's great. I always try to keep that to myself too. So I'm glad you pointed that out. You caught me. So, the thing that's been unique.
When I'm at your event in August, I might have to make a crack about that on stage. Is that okay?
It is. But I didn't go to a land-grant. I went to lowly old Southern Illinois University, which is not a land-grant. I didn't go to one of the bigs.
He's a Saluki.
Yeah. So, I think to answer your question, I think one of the things that's unique about what we've done and what we've, before I came here, before Bodie came here, before Greg got involved in what, was going on with BWFusion, this company's been around and doing biological work for 30 years. You started in remediation, got into ag kind of by accident, and really had a couple of core products that One was kind of was traditionally used in furrow as a growth promoter and phosphorus release, and another one was traditionally used. It's called Meltdown as a stalk degrader. It was a residue degradation product, and I think what happened was we start looking at the soil and tissue. We start looking at the things we're trying to find the balance of in the nutrients, and you start to see how your biology is performing on the nutrients. And we've kind of realigned in the last 12 to 18 months, utilizing the same products, but we've almost completely changed how we time and how we apply our biology based on what we've seen. Just because you see a bigger plant, depends on when the time of the year that is. You may not want bigger roots. You may not want more growth. You may not want to stimulate a plant in the way that we were. So we took that biology that we already had and kind of realigned it to better fit the growth model, so to speak, of a corn plant, of a soybean plant, et cetera. So I think that's what's been really fascinating, is to take biological products that, quite frankly, have been in our portfolio for more than a decade, and how we've been able to use soil and tissue and observations and some of these trials we talked about in the field and say, okay, maybe instead of applying this one in furrow, why don't we take this to a post-app, to maybe a herbicide pass? And when that corn's getting ready to go into that grand growth phase, so we post about V5, V6, and when that corn's about ready to take off to the races, maybe we apply that biology and we stimulate that plant at that time instead of stimulating it right out of the ground. So I think that's the big thing of what we've done, is learn how, we're still learning, but learning how the best timing to use these products. I think that's the big thing when it comes to biology.
I know there's a whole catalog of products. Let's just talk about any one of your products. You said putting in at time of planting. And for the person that's, I've got cranberry processors that listen to the Business of Agriculture podcast. So you're talking about in furrow. You mean it gets dribbled out as a liquid right in there when I'm going through the field and planting in the spring. Then you spoke about maybe another product gets applied over the top, and that's foliar, or is it getting wide drop down into the soil?
Would be more of a foliar, so more of a broadcast app, for sure.
Okay, so answer me this. We got Greg on here. He's a farmer. He's saying, it was time to pull some new tools out. It's not an issue of fertility. So the next thing is to use some biologicals. It wasn't an issue of weeds. You get the herbicide. So you've got all these things handled. How's it work? How does it work? Either of you, how does it work? How does this stuff work? I put it there. How does it work?
Sure. So you've got multiple strains. And I think that's the big thing is one thing with our products from a biological perspective, as each individual product has, 28 to 30 strains of different biology. And so there's not one thing that it does, right? There are products out there that focus solely on making more nitrogen available. We've got strains of biology that do that, strains of biology that make phosphorus available, right? So we talked about that. One thing that we talk about from a standard soil test is it tells us how much P and K is supposedly available to us. But what we've started to look at now is there's hundreds of thousands or thousands of pounds of nutrients that are in the soil that are locked away, that are unavailable. We've got strains of biology that make potassium available, strains of biology that make phosphorus available. There's strains of biology that mitigate stress. So, hormone drivers that like say, for example, ACE deaminase is a precursor to ethylene. And so it prevents ethylene buildup in the plant. We've got strains of biology that work with that to limit the ethylene production. So if you're in a stressful environment, you're trying to keep the ethylene from building in your plant, shutting that plant down. There's strains of biology that mitigate that.
I want to go to Greg about the difference. Yes, there's obviously strains of, there's a whole bunch of strains of biology,
absolutely,
et cetera. Talk about the stress reduction thing. I don't know how it is in your part of the world, but it's exceedingly dry, exceedingly stressful right now from a drought standpoint. That's not the only kind of stress. There's other kinds of stress. Does it really work? I mean, there's the promise that we're going to help reduce stress. So tell me, Greg, your experience.
Well, I think when you tie the biology to nutrition, that's when some magic can happen. Okay. So like as an example, to be focused on preparing for stress, right? Because at some point we're going to have it during the year. So how do you create a plant that ultimately, let me give you as an example, we know what the world records are on corn as an example. So it doesn't take you long to figure out that one bag of seed corn could potentially has the potential to create a semi-load of corn in response, right? We did that trial where we did soybeans at 20, 30, 50, 70, 90, 110,000.
By the way, remember, we have cranberry processors. Listen to this.
Yep.
They don't know what those numbers mean. That's population. Seeds
population, right? Seeds per acre, correct, right? And we did that in a setting in a completely flat field with irrigation and with nutrition that was consistent throughout. And that year we harvested at all of those populations where the difference in yield was only 3 bushel. They were all between 102 and 105 bushels per acre, okay? And that was weighed across the scale, and that distance was measured. What I learned from that was that all I was actually doing was I had maxed out the amount of energy that I could, or the amount of sugars that I was able to create off of that acre, right? So then we start thinking about things like because we're a predominantly cloudy area, so how do I turn that disadvantage into my advantage? How can I increase photosynthesis? Are there biologicals out there? Are they tied to a nutritional product? Are they combined in a way that we can start to think about things like, can we increase photosynthetic efficiencies? What are those things that we can do that truly drive a plant? We spent all these years thinking about nutrition, and then we start thinking about biological, and now how can we improve photosynthetic efficiency? I mean that's a frontier, right, that we're barely tapping into, right? So that's one of the things that the company has done has created a product which truly does that, and we know that because we can see what the changes are to the plant. And that exudation that we drive, or that product drives out of the plant, the extra sugars that it creates, puts it out into the soil. All of a sudden, you can see the dramatic changes within the plant, how it actually physiologically changes the plant to your eye. You don't have to have a tissue test. You don't have to have anything else to tell whether or not it's changing the plant. But we're truly combining some of those things that release the right nutrients to drive photosynthesis, as an example.
By the way, I really like that example. That's the best and most thorough answer you've given me now. It only took you 20 minutes to get warmed up, Greg. We appreciate it, because what you just told me there was first off, that is quantifiable. Because remember, the skepticism has arisen that some of the stuff is not quantifiable. Going back to going out to, spraying dual, atrazine, you could see what the hell happened. It killed a bunch of weeds, also killed a bunch of fish downstream in your neighbor's yard. But anyway, you did that. What you just said there now has a quantifiable action to it. They have a product, a biological product, they meaning BW. Is it called Full Sun, Sean?
Which is not necessarily a biological, but that's what Greg's referring to. Yes.
Yeah, you're referring to a product called Full Sun. Yeah. And the idea is, if you have an area, Indiana, Illinois, it's not sunny every single day like it is, say, in, Phoenix, where I live part of the year. Which brings up the other question. If it's not sunny, then why are they paying so much money to put solar panels on our farm fields? That's a different discussion for a different day, and one that I'm not a big fan of. Anyway, so if you can spray this product there and it actually maximizes photosynthesis, or what you're really saying is it allows your plant to still create the sugars as though it had more sun than it really has. That's what we're talking about, right? Yeah.
Right. Yep.
And if you do want the quantifiable, you can do a tissue sample and see that this over here has more sugar content, which is starch, which builds a plant, right, Sean?
Yeah, that's exactly right. When you asked me how it works, what I should have said simply was the plant feeds the soil feeds the plant. And I should have just said that, because when we talk about whether it's Full Sun, whether we talk about biology, that's what's happening. If we spray Full Sun, if we create more sugars, we get more root exudates. Those root exudates are sugars that stimulate biology. We stimulate the biology, we release nutrients back to the plant, and the plant gets the benefit of that release of nutrients.
Go back to the
cycle of it.
Sean, let's go back to the quantifiable part of it, because like I said, the skepticism arises because it's like, this stuff's magic. Well, it's not really magic. You actually do have data. You actually do have trials. You actually do have data, right?
Absolutely. And that's what we look at, is increases in tissue values and getting nutrients into the plant that we want to raise those levels to bring about that balance that we talked about at the beginning.
All right, then go to Greg. You're the farmer. Our friends in the suburbs like the idea that there's these farmers out here, and it's so wholesome, it's so neat. And then sometimes I forget it's a business, which is why I call this the business of agriculture. You're spending more money. Did you cut back somewhere else? Does using products like their products does it allow you to reshuffle the budget? How do you look at this?
Oh, absolutely. Because ultimately, that's the goal, right? I mean, we got to stay in business. I mean, we use the word sustainable for our soil. I want sustainable for my farm, also, right? I mean, I have
economics.
Yeah, I mean, I have children that want to continue. I'm fourth generation. We want to carry this on, right? So we got to look at not only what are we doing for today, but what are we doing for tomorrow, and how does that fit in economically with everything that we do, right? So if we can, through the use of a biological, if I can quit using so much, spreading as much NPK as an example, I mean, we've actually reduced our inputs. That was my favorite thing about last year, and all the experiments that we did last year was I'd been down that path of going to listening to every high yield person that I could listen to. And eventually I found myself in this crazy situation where I was doing things that were never going to work. I mean, it's embarrassing to say, but we compete in the NCGA contest, and I'm doing things like 20 to 25 passes on a field, which is, that's not an agronomical practice, right? But we're just trying to find out where the answers drive yield. And we're stimulating plants in ways that we don't even know what we're doing. We're driving it to the left and driving it to the right, all with the same pass that we throw out there. And pretty soon, we have no way of measuring or quantifying anything. And so last year, I said, okay, I've got to do a different approach. And I focused on things like, how do I release things from the soil, and how do I improve photosynthetic efficiencies? And I did those couple of practices, and I cut my passes down to 3 or 4 passes. And all of a sudden, in a year when we shouldn't have had record yields, I mean, I had the highest yielding corn that I've ever had when I greatly reduced my input, cut my cost in half, did a lot of things differently, but focused just thinking about things differently and what I wanted out of that plant, realizing that the plant has so much potential, but so much of the time we're the ones that are actually, we're holding it back, right? Truthfully, I mean, that bag has X number has a certain amount of potential in it when you plant that seed. And what we're trying to do is think about, how do we capture more of that instead of thinking about all the time as farmers are, I used to look for that silver bullet. What would add 4 bushel? What would add 3 bushel? What would add 6 bushel? Well, in reality, we're not really adding, we're just capturing more of what was the potential was. I'm trying to prevent from losing as much, right? The degradation from the time we plant that seed to the time that we harvest it. And we think about stuff like photosynthesis. Well, if we can increase that, I don't care whether it's corn, soybeans, wheat, cranberries. You talked about the cranberry grower, right? I mean, those are the kind of things we think about in all plants and all of nature.
Yeah, very thorough.
Limit the loss.
Question for you. You work with BW as a farmer, helping them formulate some of these biological products. Mm-hmm. Do you use other companies' biologicals on your farming operation?
I do not at this time. I do not. I mean, when I came to the company, like, one of the things that I got to know that what we're creating, what I'm looking at, that it truly works and it fits on my farm and what it's doing. And I like to physically see the change. We've been tissue testing here for probably 10 years, every week. I used to be that guy that, couldn't wait to get the tissue test back. You live and die by it. And most weeks you die because it's never what you want it to be, but you're learning from it. But I wanted to actually see physiological change, and I wanted to build a better plant. I didn't want to grow a plant anymore. And I think that's what we're trying to do now is we're taking the knowledge that we're learning through the combination of biologicals, nutrition, enzymes, amino acids, putting all of that kind of stuff all into one product as an example that creates a better plant that requires less energy. We lose so much energy from the plant trying to process all of these things. What we're trying to do is to let that plant use less energy for itself from a vegetative standpoint and put it more into reproductive energy so that plant we can actually harvest more. I mean, ultimately, that's the goal, right? And to do it on less input.
So speaking of the biologicals and the business side of it, so you said, yes, you've reshuffled your budget. You're spending less on traditional inputs, meaning fertilizers, especially the macros. Have you been allowed to cut back on anything else? Less insecticide, less herbicide, anything like that? Or has that stayed the same? Is it mostly just fertility that you've cut back on and used and taken some of that and a portion of that budget to biologicals?
Oh, no, we've cut back on those also. Just by building a healthier plant. a healthier soil, but in a healthier plant, one that the leaves are more protected from fungus, one that's maybe less nitrate dense, that will protect us more. We're not as attractive to insect eating. Those are the kind of things that you can think about. Yeah, absolutely.
Is this going to be a thing you think, Sean, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? I've told my audiences, and I truly believe this, we're going to look back at all this tillage that we're still doing in the year 2023, the way we look back at primitive medicine when they use leeches for healthcare. Hey, you're sick. Let's go ahead and take a couple gallons of blood out of you with these leeches. That's how we're going to look at this tillage. I believe that. I believe we overtill. We just degrade soil structure. I've said it since I was 18 years old in FFA and a soil judging participant in the soils team. Are we going to look at all the use of chemistry and say, holy shit, they really overused chemistry, and they really should have been going down the path of more biologicals, which are on the verge of organic?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. I think it's, not going to say that chemistry is bad or wrong, but dry fertilizer is chemistry, and herbicides and fungicides and insecticides. And let's be honest, we used to have an IPM approach. You don't hear IPM anymore because over time, the insecticides, the fungicides, they've all gotten cheaper. They've gotten to where, I can spray this and I can spend $2.
Yeah, what's the IPM? What's the IPM approach?
Well, so that used to be the integrated pest management approach, and universities still talk about it, but nobody pays any attention to it because these things are too cheap not to just throw them out there, right? So I think that you're exactly right. I think that as you improve the plant health, some of these things become less necessary. And I think in time, you're right. I think we look back and say, man, we messed up. But it always takes history to teach us those things.
Yeah. So do we ever get away, Greg, does biologicals then, do we replace this stuff 20 years from now? Are you going to say we don't even use fungicide anymore because we've got between the genetics and the biologicals, we've got no need for it? I mean, what do you think? Take me 20 years from now when you're handing this over to your kid.
Well, I think ultimately that would be the goal, right? But whether or not we can ever get there, we don't know the answer to that, right? We're going to learn more as every year goes by through research or science. We know a lot more today than we knew 10 years ago, even 3 or 4 years ago. And I think this whole world of knowledge, the unknown, I don't know where it ends up, but I hope we can get there someday. Yeah. I think that's ultimately a great goal.
Take me down through the fields of McClure Farms and answer me this. You spoke about a product that improves photosynthesis. It doesn't improve photosynthesis. It takes it makes a plant. What I'm hearing is a plant that doesn't get as much sun. It makes it think it got a whole bunch more sun, right? It takes what little bit of sun it gets on a cloudy week and does a hell of a lot more with it. So it makes it more efficient. Tell me another BWFusion product, biological, that you use on your farm and what it does. Give me even an example.
Well, another one that we have that's new this year is called BioCast Max, and we like to use that product earlier in the plant's life. It's a biological that we spray foliar, but we also want to get some of it onto the ground, and that's the combination of our two biggest consortiums of biologicals or that the company has, and they do two very different functions. We're trying to consistently build as much organic carbon in our soil. We're trying to release that. We're trying to put it in the soil, and then we're trying to release it to the biology. We're trying to release it to the plants. So that product does a combination of those things. And through that enhancement, then we see physiological changes to the plant. We see it drive nutrition uptake. We see a lot of functional things, and as well as physiological, both externally and internally within the plant, the changes that it's making.
Got it. And then you kicked things off by talking about manure. Sean, take me down this road. He talked about manure, as he called it, because it's newer versus older. Manure. Anyway, that's more about than getting, I guess, maybe organic stuff. One of the things we hear about biologicals is that it enhances soil activity. And I'm like, okay, well, then tell me what that means. So let's talk about soil activity. What do we
Sure.
put out there? Because that's what one of the promises of biologicals, yours and others, right?
Well, and I think we have to measure that, right? And I think, not something that a traditional standard soil test does for us. And so we use Jason's lab, Next Level Ag in South Dakota. We use the Agronomy 365 program to try to quantify some of this stuff. And what we're looking at is some of these soil health metrics, like our HT3 CO2 burst. What you're measuring is how biologically active that soil is, right? And so when you take a manure field or a manure application, a lot of times you're going to see more biological activity in that soil than you do one that's never seen manure. And so those are the things that we're trying to quantify, is how biologically active that soil is. And that a lot of that, between that and the carbon that Greg mentioned, we measure those things. That's gonna give us a lot of dictation on what kind of response we may expect to see from some of this biology. Because let's be honest, I think that there are farms out there that may not see as much benefit from biology as a farm that's maybe been abused. And let's be honest, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with the way we farm, but when we farm the same way over and over, whether one group calls it monoculture or whatever you call it, that's where you start to select for specific strains of biology. We're just kind of re-inoculating that soil, I think is the way to put it, in a way that manure's done that forever. It re-inoculates that soil.
If I use some of your stuff for 10 years, does my soil get to where it's right and I don't need any more of this enhancement? Or do you think this is going to be ongoing?
I think it's ongoing. We've got a pretty lengthy trial that's been conducted it's been in the state of Iowa. And I think it's on its 5th year now. And what we see is the soil structure, the soil nutrient release, the nutrient values of that soil continue to get better over time. Mm-hmm. It was fast at first, but now you're seeing that overall improvement of the soil just in general, to the point where I don't know. I don't know that 20 years from now, if you're using biology and you're doing the things to enhance the biological activity to make them thrive, if you ever get to a point where you don't need them. But I do know that what we've seen thus far in several years is that we've continued to make that soil better.
Greg McClure, the neighbor that's skeptical, you've already kind of addressed a bunch of that. But when someone comes to your farm that's still asking the questions, do you show them results? What do you do? What's your answer? Does this stuff really work? When you say this stuff really work, you tell them what? You say, here's my way tickets from the elevator. What do you show them?
Well, I think it's I think a lot of farmers, they're skeptical by nature. I don't think I was any different. I think that's where that's healthy. That's okay to be skeptical, but I don't think it's healthy to be closed-minded. And I think you've got to seek out those answers, and that's what really the great thing about some of the products that BW has is that you can physically, you can use something like Full Sun as an example. I'm just going to use that one as one product. There's other ones the same way. I mean, I can take them out into the field and we can go apply that product, and we come back a few days later and side by side, and I can let them go out and pick the plants. I don't even go out and pick the plants. I just say, you go out over in this section of field, and you go over in this and then you go over in this section of field, and you bring back 3 plants that you think are average plants on both. And we'll dig them up, bring them back to the tailgate, and we'll cut them open. And I don't even go pick those. And to be able to tell them what you're going to see ahead of time helps validate that whole process. Visually for farmers, because we can't visually see what's inside the plant, but all of a sudden you're cutting the plant open and you're seeing a different vascular system. You're seeing one that looks healthy. You're seeing vascular bundles within that plant. And you can explain that, that's where the nutrition goes up and down. You think about things like what drives stem diameter, and you can show them that this product will increase stem diameter. And then you ask the simple question have you ever been in a cornfield where there's 2 plants evenly spaced and the one with the smaller stem diameter has a larger ear? And the answer comes back invariably, no, I've never seen that in my life. So do you think stem diameter is important? Because that is the straw. That's how we uptake nutrients and water out of the soil. Those things that you talk to them about, physiological changes to the plant, a bigger leaf, a bigger solar panel. How does the solar panel, what direction is it? What's the midrib, the vascular system of that plant? I mean, the company is looking at things like we talk soil health. And then you've got people maybe on the fungicide talking about plant health as an example. And really, we're looking at that circle of soil health and plant health and thinking about how plant health actually drives soil health, which is kind of a different perspective for most, because most are thinking if I get my soil healthy, then my plant will be healthier.
Yeah.
We're improving soil health through a healthier plant. You asked earlier about fungicides. I mean, a fungicide is an example. Do we know that it's only killing pathogens, or do you think it's potentially that it could be killing some of those important ones to us for the future? Are we killing stuff off in our soils that we need tomorrow, that we actually needed today? Are there things that we're doing? I think that's what this company is about, and they're trying to look at is it's not only how do we help the farmer today, but how do we help the farmer of tomorrow? And that's what drives me, because I have kids. I want to leave it for them, just like my father left it for me.
Or better. Sean, I got to tell you, I actually have been saying this to my audiences for a long time, that I believe this is where things are going. It's about the biology, and we're going to understand that. We don't understand soil biology at all. We talk about soil health, and in the same breath, you talk about soil health and go to the Farm Progress Show, and they've got a tractor that weighs 27 tons, pulling something with a shank that's as big and as long as my arm, beating the hell out of the soil, 16 inches down, 13 inches down in some cases. And then we talk about soil health. I'm like, I don't think this is not compatible, but I do believe that, you know what? We used to throw antibiotics around like they were candy, right? We'd put in the drip lines in the chicken barns and all that. And we are not the reason for antibiotic resistance. There is overprescription among humans, but we are certainly part of the problem. We're probably that way on a lot of these chemicals. And I think now like this focus on gut health, eating sauerkraut, which I love making sauerkraut. Those are kind of probiotics. That's where I think this is I equate that to this. That's where I think you are. Am I right?
I think you're 100% right. I think one of the things that interests me, I'm not a doctor by any stretch of the imagination, but when you see something that we're talking about biologically, nutritional health, plant health, like Greg's talking about, and how we can drive that with nutrition a lot of times. Yeah. And then you see the correlation, you see the parallel back to the same thing the nutritionists are talking about for you or I. They are exactly parallel. And we think about, if you're focusing on plant health, the message is the same on what we should be focusing on for our own health, really. And to me, that's one of the most fascinating things about what we're seeing.
Well, and to Greg's point also about, new dog, old tricks, or old dog, new tricks, or whatever you want to call it there. I'm sure there's a doctor that practiced in the 1950s and 60s that was just throwing a prescription for antibiotics left and right. And that's not the way we think now. And we don't think that way for a reason. So it's kind of the same thing, I think, with soil and plant health, to Greg's point. All right, Greg.
Extremely parallel.
I'm getting out of here now. All right, Greg. We got to wrap this episode up. I'm sure I'll see you again. Am I going to see you in August?
Correct. Yes, sir.
And we're going to put drinks on Sly's bill?
Absolutely.
I really like the way you think. He's Greg McClure, farmer in Illinois. If you want to find him, I'm sure you can somehow through BWFusion. Sean Nettleton is also agronomist for BWFusion. I'm going to be speaking at their event in Peoria, Illinois, August 24th. If you happen to be part of this organization, or if you're invited to it, come there. I'm going to be talking about the Asians of agriculture. That's right, the Asians of agriculture, everything from population to regulation to inflation that is impacting our industry. Till next time, thank you very much for being here. Go and check out the app. It's free. Put it on your phone from AgVisor Pro. You got questions, they've got answers. You know what? Not they. It's a community of people that are there to help. And you can even become part of that community also. Go to AgVisor Pro, put it on your phone. Till next time, thanks for being here, guys. I'm Damian.
Thank you.
Thanks.
This is the Business of Agriculture.
Well, that concludes another fantastic episode of the Business of Agriculture. This episode was brought to you by Pattern Ag. Everybody in agriculture understands the importance of soil health. We also keep an eye on our soil better than we ever did through advanced soil testing. But what if there was a company that provided predictive analytics, not just checking out nutrients and all the elements that are in there, but also could tell you the degree of risk you face with disease and pest pressure?
That's right. Pattern Ag can do that. They actually can tell you, hey, you're going to have a real issue here. You can preemptively, proactively treat for corn rootworm or cyst nematode or sudden death syndrome before the problem actually starts costing you yield. Go to pattern.ag. That's www.pattern.ag to find the nearest rep that can help you start doing better for your soil.